It looks like you beautiful people seem to enjoy the last episode of Scary Work Stories I did. So here's another 2 hours of new work-related horror stories. To be clear, what you're about to hear are episodes 6 through 10 of my other Scary Stories podcast, called Tales from the Break Room. For those who don't know, I actually do more scary stories than what you see on this channel. Tales from the Break Room is all about the scariest allegedly real encounters people have at work or on their commute. Enjoy, and please take a second to rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and/or Apple Podcasts using the links in the description and pinned comment. It helps the show reach new viewers. Thank you. Now, let's begin.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Sorry if I'm a bit more irritable than usual. Something keeps eating our night shift employees. I've had to hire 4 different workers for the night crew in the past 2 weeks, and half of them are already being digested. You see, I warned that thing it could have 1 a month, but at this rate I'll be raking in the overtime. For now, it's time for my break, and today, my friend, that means some allegedly real ghost stories from those lucky workers who either close up late at night or have to arrive early to open. After that, I've got a bonus story for you that's different than our usual. So grab an iced coffee, kick back, and enjoy these tales from the break room. The Third Floor, from Adrian. In my early 20s, I worked at my local Sears, where many strange things happened. It's been about a decade since then, and the store doesn't exist anymore. So I don't feel bad sharing these stories. While there were people that passed away in the store or in the mall it was attached to, I think a lot of the activity has to do with the land it was built on. Here in Hawaii, there is a finite amount of space to build things. So a lot of the buildings you see, the schools and businesses, are old World War II hospitals or morgues that were bought up and renovated. For some perspective, the entire mall and the attached Sears sits only 2 miles from Pearl Harbor. When I started working there, I was assigned to the 3rd floor, which housed 4 departments: children's clothing, women's undergarments, small home appliances, and mattresses. While every department in the store had its own creepy occurrences, I think working on the 3rd floor was the worst. On the 1st floor, there were incidents of people appearing on the security cameras after closing time, only for them to remain unseen when someone went to look for them. On the 2nd floor, in women's apparel, there was a guy, a pervert, who shimmied up into the ceiling of the fitting rooms and stayed there for about a week, unnoticed, until one night when he set off the store alarm. After that, whenever we had to clear those fitting rooms at the end of the night, it was extremely unsettling to open all the doors by yourself. As for the 3rd floor, I don't know which shift had it the worst. More than once in the closing shift, you'd be folding clothes and hear the fitting room alarm going off like someone was jumping back and forth in front of it. Like bing bong, bing bong, bing bong, bing bong. It happened so often after the store was closed, our floor manager had to turn it off permanently. In the opening shift, sometimes we would find a stack of toddler shirts knocked over, or baby strollers, which had apparently willed themselves into a different department. While you could say it was an oversight of the closing team or a prank, these little things happen too often to be mistakes or jokes. One of the worst common occurrences on the 3rd floor was finding the little foot and handprints of children by the cashier station. It was weird to find them in the morning, because we knew the cleanup crew had swept the night before. And it was unsettling because the feet were always bare feet, with individual toes and heel prints. None of the children's mannequins had lifelike feet that could have been used to make them, and none of the people working had small enough feet to do it either. So whenever we'd find one, we would just look at each other for a moment and pretend it wasn't there. I mean, what else could we do? We tried debunking them the first few times, but it's not like we had the time or the tools to really investigate what was actually going on. So we often tried to ignore the weird things that happened. But some things are unavoidable. One morning, a group of us came in to do markdowns. Back then, we had to manually scan each item, then individually tag them as clearance. So you can imagine how long it would take a department like children's clothing to do this with all the small items. I won't use their real names, but the 6 of us split up the department to try to cover more ground before the store opened. Mia and I were in the middle, sorting through boys' jeans, when 2 of our coworkers approached us shaken and obviously bothered by something they had seen. "I think there's someone walking around in home appliances," Ella said. Something about her quiet yet serious tone made my gut clench. It didn't help that her partner, Chloe, was standing with her arms tightly crossed, shifting from foot to foot, her eyes glued to the empty home appliance aisles across the store. "It was a woman," Chloe added with her eyes still fixed away from us. "Maybe it was just someone taking a long detour to the bathroom," Mia offered. It wasn't uncommon in the morning, if there was no manager present, to take long strolls through other departments before the store opened. In fact, this happened a lot more when it was a markdown day. When you work in a big store, it's not unusual for your coworkers from other departments to be curious about newly marked clearance items. But she wasn't walking towards the bathrooms. She walked from there to the back of the store, Ella explained. Together, the 4 of us looked at the path she pointed out, then towards the back of the store. We saw it. I really hadn't been expecting to see anything, so when I caught a glimpse of someone walking through the aisles at the back of the store, my whole body clenched up. They didn't have horns or a big smile, but there was something unmistakably wrong about the pale face and dark hair that moved so casually through the dark aisles in the closed store across from us. Without speaking, we all quickly went to find our team leader. "It was probably just a vendor," our team leader Emily explained. "They're not our employees, but their company sends them from time to time to set up their own merchandise displays." At first, I was comforted by the explanation, but my other coworkers weren't, so we decided to go as a group to home appliances to see if we could find anyone. And we couldn't. We didn't. There was no one there. Every time I try to swallow the explanation that it was just a vendor or a cleaner, I just can't. It doesn't make sense, and thinking about it to this day still makes my skin crawl. The display aisles in my home appliance department were 6 feet tall, which means that the person or whatever we saw that morning had to have been much taller than 6 feet in order for us to see their head above the aisle. The Dog Farm, from Bryce R. When I was in high school, I was looking for a part-time job. I eventually found one that sounded perfect. It was a greyhound farm, which was owned and run by my baseball coach. Knowing all the guys that worked there made this too good to be true. After working there, I learned there are multiple shifts that we call turnouts, where we'd go to the farm and turn out all the dogs from inside the buildings out. There are 2 times for this, besides morning shifts, one afternoon and one later in the evening, about when it starts getting dark. When I first began working there, I always had someone with me who would perform the turnouts for me. But as I got more experience, I figured everything out, and I was able to start doing it all by myself. My first late turnout went super well. I did the usual feeding of puppies, letting dogs out, and just sitting and waiting before putting them all up and heading home. As I kept doing the late turnouts, things got creepy. It began with simple things, like lights being on after knowing you had just turned them off. I didn't put much thought into this, other than the fact that I may have been distracted at the time and forgot to shut it off. I was a teenager after all, and I was practically addicted to my phone. Eventually, when I was mixing the feed for the puppies, things got even weirder. The door that led to all the dogs just opened out of nowhere, and it sounded like someone was walking down the aisle. This made no sense, because if someone was doing this, the dogs would be going nuts. But there was nothing but the sound of footsteps. So I hurried out of the building, deciding to go feed the pups and continue with turnout. The rest of that night went smooth, but the following night wasn't so good. I remember the same footsteps happening all the time. I remember the sensation of feeling watched at all times on the farm, which was just wrong, because no one lived on the farm. It was just dogs. Many nights, the dogs would go from completely silent to raising hell in a matter of seconds, but there was no way to see what they were barking at. So I figured it was maybe another dog somewhere on the farm, maybe a dog that got out or something. While this was still creepy, it still possibly had some kind of rational explanation. I eventually talked with a buddy of mine I'd worked with, and he told me the truth that I wasn't at all prepared for. Before my boss had purchased the land to turn it into a dog farm, the previous owner had hung himself in the barn. At night, you could sometimes hear him walking around some of the buildings. Of course, wanting to see if he was pulling my leg or being factual about this, I talked to my boss, who told me the exact same story. On my next turnout, I specifically remember leaving doors open and lights on, purposely, to see what would happen, to see if I could catch anything weird. And I did. That night, after all the dogs were in the yard, they all huddled in the corner furthest from the building, which was strange because it was raining. Most of the time when it's raining, the dogs sit under the roof, unless they need to relieve themselves. All of a sudden, I hear the big door slam shut, harder than what a draft could do. Slowly, I walked inside to investigate, and that's when I found footprints of muddy boots which appeared to have walked from one side of the building to the other. Knowing I only came in one door and the fact I was wearing tennis shoes, this was horrifying. I told myself maybe it's my boss helping me out with the dogs before the storm gets too crazy. I then hear the crack of thunder and lightning, with the sounds of dogs barking wildly now. I ran outside to see what was going on, and I see that one of the dogs had been struck by lightning. I called my boss to let him know of the unfortunate event, to which he said, "I'll be there in 5 minutes. Gotta get dressed." So my boss wasn't there. If those footprints weren't his, then whose were they? To this day, I wonder who it was or what it was that made those muddy boot prints on the floor, and why a dog had been struck by lightning, which had never happened there before. Did I upset the spirit of the old farmer by leaving doors open and lights on, or was it just an unfortunate event? I doubt I'll ever know, and I'm okay with that. Before we begin the next story, let me say something first. This story is not at all believable. If you ask me, it sounds like someone submitted a creepypasta. That is just my opinion, though, and you're free to form your own. I'll read it this time if you keep in mind that this last story is likely fake, but still well written and enjoyable. But please remember, if you're going to send us a story for me to narrate on Tales from the Break Room, they must be allegedly true and believable. Future stories like this will be rejected. This is not meant to be a podcast for creepypasta, aka fictional horror stories. Thank you. Trash Duty from Perfect Blue. Ever since I turned 15, I've worked at a quaint diner adjacent to an interstate. I won't say exactly where, but it's really the only eye-catching building you'd see down that boring road. It's big, too big, considering how few menu items we have. It stands out like a sore thumb among the tall trees and foggy clouds. The only indication of what its purpose is being a giant illuminated sign that reads, you guessed it, Diner, plastered across the high point. This was my first real job, and I'm not too proud to say I've made a career out of it. At first, it began as a part-time thing, just me trying to scrape together some extra money to move out of my little town. Then one of the cooks quit, so I took their place full-time. From there, executive chef, not that there was any difference from my previous title really, but still I kept going up when vacancies opened. Now as the general manager, I don't do too much. The owner is almost never there. I relax, sit in the back office and approve timesheets, maintenance requests, and supply orders. That's pretty much it, aside from trash duty. Yeah, I know, usually taking out the garbage is something the part-time kid does. Ordinarily, I'd agree with you, but when it comes to this diner, things work a little differently. I remember back on my first day, I wanted to show initiative. So when I finished my tasks, I decided to take it upon myself to empty the overflowing trash can in the back of the kitchen. I took the bag out, wrapped it tight, and headed out the back exit, closest to the dumpster. That's when I was stopped by some sort of alarm. Not like a fire alarm or anything, just a simple buzz. Confused, I turned, only to see the then manager, the guy who was training me, sprinting down the back kitchen hallway, his face stressed and beet red. "Hey!" He shouted at me and I blinked at him, confused. "What do you think you're doing?" Taking out the garbage?" "Give me that!" He yelled at me, yanking the bag out of my hand. I was so surprised. I tried to explain myself. I just thought, shaking his head, he cut me off. "I take out the trash, no one else, got it?" Still totally unsure of what was going on, I nodded, only to see him nod back and turn away, taking the garbage with him. I didn't really know what had just happened. After a minute or two, I shrugged it off, thinking the manager had some sort of control issue, and I tried to stop thinking about it. I did ask one of the cooks though, but he didn't have much to say. "I don't know, man. He takes out the trash, it's always been like that." Over the next few weeks, I never really touched the trash. I had no desire to be barked at again, and not having to deal with the trash was a +1 for me. Of course, there was a nagging curiosity that was begging to know why only the manager would take out the trash. It was easy enough to ignore. Until one night when I was working an extra hour to help sort out a giant delivery of food. It was around midnight. I was in the kitchen, and I heard the telltale sound of the metal garbage can being knocked around. I walked 2 rows down and looked over, seeing my boss pulling the trash out of the can. He nodded the bag and opened up the door, and out he went. As he left, I walked myself to the exit, keeping the door open a few inches, and watched him. As one would expect, he walked over to the dumpster, which was illuminated by the singular pale light attached to the rear of the building. He pushed open the lid and hoisted the bag inside. I sighed. It was totally routine. Does it really take the manager to do all that? About to turn away, I heard him mutter under his breath, and I returned my attention. "Come on," he spoke in a gruff, almost aggressive voice. "Come on, you bastard, where are you?" Interested, I watched. Who was he talking to? His attention was on the woods directly behind the dumpster. I was thinking about calling to him, but then I began to pick up on a sound. It was faint at first, gradually coming towards the building. At first, I was reminded of a horse galloping. As it got closer, though, it sounded a lot more intense. I could hear trees and branches being split apart, and these thunderous footsteps that seemed far too fast and heavy to belong to any animal I was familiar with. My boss, meanwhile, was focused on where it was coming from, and though he looked nervous, it was clear he was expecting whatever was making its way over. The sounds cut out for just a moment, as if it, whatever it was, had stopped moving, though the silence only lasted a moment as it was split by a loud bang. I watched as the dumpster, which wasn't on any wheels, mind you, was sent 4 or 5 feet away from where it had been before. My eyes searched the low brightness for what had pushed it, and then, for the first time, I saw it. The Garbage Man. That's just a nickname anyway. Beyond being bipedal, it has no resemblance to a man. It was pasty white, its flesh not at all a healthy color. It looked to be about 10 feet tall. Its bone structure was oversized, easily showing through its gross skin. Its face lacked a nose, the only features being 2 beady eyes as big as tennis balls and a gaping circular mouth, like that of a lamprey. I was frozen as I stared at it. It was so wrong, so out of place with nature, and yet captivating. It crawled up the rear side of the dumpster, its breathing heavy and labored. It stared at my boss, and he stared back unflinching. The standoff went on for 10 seconds before it dived its way into the dumpster, pulling its body entirely inside. The noises that followed indicated to me it was devouring the contents of the trash. My boss let out a sigh, relaxing himself. "There you go. enjoy it." With that, he turned around. I gained back control of my body just as he did, ducking out of the doorway before he saw me. I had absolutely zero clue how to process what I'd just witnessed. I remember finishing my work almost robotically and leaving the same way, not speaking to any of my coworkers on the way out. I did not return to work for a week after that. I mean, would you? I cited some illness I didn't actually have whenever they called, and I did my best to focus on other things. But money doesn't grow on trees. I had bills to pay, and given the fact that my wage was a lot better than another starting position elsewhere, I didn't have much choice but to return. My first day back, I remember wrapping around the back of the building when the sun was still high in the sky. Inconspicuously, the dumpster was where it should have been, perpendicular to the white lines on the pavement. I looked inside. It was just an empty metal bin. Nothing to indicate some sort of creature had been inside of it. Granted, I didn't know what I was looking for. Evidence of what I'd seen, I guess. But I found none. I knew I hadn't imagined it, though. It was simply too vivid. I debated what to do next. I could confront my boss and demand some sort of explanation, or I could even go to the authorities, police or rangers or even the FBI. I didn't know what the best angle was. As it turned out, I didn't have to make that choice for myself. When I entered the diner, everything seemed normal. One of the waitresses greeted me, and apparently upon hearing my name, my boss stumbled out of the back, stopping just past the flapping door to look at me. "We need to talk, you and I." He turned around, pacing loudly to his office. I followed, my heart sunken. One of two things was about to happen. Either I'd be reprimanded and possibly fired for my week-long absence, or he was about to grill me about the incident that took place the night before. I didn't know which one I preferred. "You saw it, didn't you?" That was the first line he spoke when he sat down. He didn't seem mad. There wasn't a hint of aggression in his voice. Even still, I tried to feign ignorance. Saw what?" "The garbage man." Upon him saying that, I decided to be honest. Yeah, I did." "I'm sure you got a lot of questions then." "Not really, no. Honestly, I don't want to know anything." He laughed then, very relaxed, obviously not at all minding that I had seen the creature. "You sound like me, you know." "What do you mean?" "I mean, when I first saw him, boss man couldn't pay me $1,000 to talk about him." I blinked at him, confused. I didn't know what to think. With that line, it seemed there was a good bit of history with whatever I'd seen that night. Before I could reply, he began to explain. "Back when I first started here, right after the place had just been changed from the pharmacy or whatever it used to be, I caught my boss talking to himself whenever he took out the trash. One night, I decided to follow him, just like you did, and I watched that thing come screeching out of the woods, crashing into the dumpster." "The, garbage man, you mean?" "Yeah, the one and only." "So, what is it?" "I don't know. He didn't either." "And it eats trash?" "Pretty much." "What's the deal? You never called the cops or anything?" "Why would we?" I stood up, about to argue how terrible and unnatural the creature I saw was, with someone who was a lot more familiar with it than I. But I really didn't have anything to say. "Look, I don't know what the thing is. Some sort of undiscovered animal or an alien or some crazy crap. The point is, it plays nice so long as you give it the garbage. No need to call the cops." "But what if you don't?" "Trust me, you want to give it the garbage." That was about as far as the conversation went. I remember him telling me something about not mentioning it to us all. Not that anyone would believe me anyway, before I left his office. He never did explain what would happen if I didn't throw the trash out every evening, though. Over the next few months, I tried to do my shift work as by the book as possible. Not once did I try to accompany my boss on his garbage runs, and not once did he ask me to. But I did notice a quiet $5 seemed to be added onto my hourly wage each time I got my paycheck. We seemed to reach an understanding where neither one of us would ever mention it, and that was something I was perfectly fine with, because I thought the job was only temporary. But as you might know, those hopes are often optimistic. I finished up my school with a degree that was effectively useless considering where I lived, and so I couldn't get any jobs locally that made much more compared to what I got at the diner. So I stayed put. My day, aside from work, consisted of sending out remote applications with ZipRecruiter and Indeed to any city in drivable distance. As time went on, I eventually moved my way up through the ranks to management. Like I said, most people work here as a part-time thing, so it wasn't too hard to get promoted when the person directly above me quit. Soon enough, I was working right below my boss. Even still, we didn't talk about the garbage man. Ever. He was an older guy, a good bit overweight. And so one day when we were replacing old furniture with recently upholstered diner chairs, I didn't pay too much attention to when he fell out of breath. He mumbled something about needing to lie down, and I took a look at him. His face was splotchy with red and white discoloration making weird patterns. His hands had the same effect too. The quick break turned into an incident when he found it hard to get up, and the words he was speaking became slurred. Of course, I called an ambulance. It seemed like a stroke or a heart attack, something like that. The ambulance arrived pretty quickly considering where we were, and they took him away. He never showed up after that. I didn't know if he died or just retired or whatever. We never had enough of a relationship that would facilitate me reaching out. Regardless, a week later, the owner showed up. I remember him deliberating with the staff for an hour before unofficially promoting me to the title of general manager. I recall him asking if I knew how to do everything, and I gave him a passive, yeah, just trying my best to snag the role. As it turned out, approving timesheets was a mess I really wasn't ready for. But I got through it. My first night as GM, I must have stayed till 2 a.m., filling out the overly complicated PDFs. When I got up and locked up my office, I could tell by the lights being off I was the last one there. So I made my way to the back of the building, heading out the door. The sight of the spottily painted green dumpster in front of me reminded me of what I'd forgotten: trash duty. I hadn't thought about it in so long. Considering the old boss wasn't there anymore, was I supposed to take the trash out? I checked the time on my phone. It was way past midnight. Despite me remembering now, I'd already missed the deadline. I remember growing sweaty, a little nauseous, worried about what was going to happen. My old boss's one line, about always wanting to give it the garbage, echoed through my head. Turning the corner around the building, I walked up to my car before stopping. I looked at it. My jaw dropped. It had been totally eviscerated. The inexpensive sedan looked like it had been bashed in from every direction, each door dented in, each window obliterated. Even some of the rubber around the rims was missing. In the split second my brain ran through possible explanations, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. The garbage man. It was rolling around one of the hubcapless tires effortlessly with one arm. I dropped something out of shock. I'm not sure what, probably a water bottle, and the clang it made as it hit the pavement rang out across the quiet parking lot. Immediately, the garbage man turned towards me, locking eyes on me as its toy rolled out of view. Its labored breathing seemed to ramp up, and within seconds, it was in a dead sprint towards me, galloping on all four limbs. Automatically, I took off back towards the building. Somehow, I aced the key on the first try, managing to get myself in through the back before it closed the distance. I heard the garbage man thud loudly against the door only seconds later. Further footsteps seemed to indicate it was pacing around the exit, waiting for me to leave. I sat there petrified. I knew if it really wanted to get in, at any point it could. The physique of that thing and what it had done to my car made it clear it could rip the back door off its hinges at any point. The fact that it hadn't yet made it seemed like it was waiting for something, and I was pretty sure I knew what that thing was. Grabbing the black bag out of the can, I looked at it, not at all confident. There was hardly anything inside. It looked to be mostly paper towels. I couldn't see any food scraps whatsoever. Even so, that's what I had, so I quickly knotted it, took a deep breath, and left the building, walking over to the dumpster. As soon as I exited, I could see it, standing directly to my left, looming. Its knees, now straight and unbuckled, made it look even taller than it did before. My peripheral vision could pick up saliva dripping from its mouth as it let out disgusting wheezing sounds. It stood perched, as if about to jump on me, but I didn't turn to look at it in more detail. I pressed on, only a few steps remaining. When I reached the dumpster, I threw the garbage bag into it, and not a second later, the garbage man barreled after it, jumping in and hungrily ripping the bag to shreds. I didn't even look for as much as a second before I turned around and headed back inside to the protection of the building. I watched through the dirty glass window as it ripped and teared for a good few minutes before I decided to head back into my office. I think I put some music on, tried my best to relax. Believe me, that was the very last time I was ever late with trash duty. Nowadays, I have about 20 alarms set, with 5-minute intervals leading up to 12 a.m. on my phone. Not once will I ever miss it, so long as I have this job. Not once. As for what the garbage man actually is, I haven't a clue. I don't need to know, though. We have a relationship, it and I. I give it trash, and it eats it. It's straightforward, it's simple, and it's a lot more efficient than waiting for the weekly pickup. So whenever I find myself lying awake at night, thinking too hard about it, I just remember one thing. So long as I take out the trash on time, it'll leave well enough alone. Well, hey there. I appreciate you stopping by to check on me at home. Yeah, I'm not at the break room today. I called in sick from Dead and Roasted because I think I've got a pretty bad sinus infection. So I do apologize, today's episode is shorter than usual. But do you really want sinus drainage in your coffee? You do? Well, to each their own. While I focus on getting better, I will share with you 2 especially creepy work stories. One about being nearly taken on the way home, and the other about the worst thing that can happen when flesh meets machine. Also, keep in mind, this show is about stories that happen at work, on the way to work, or on the way home from work. That's always been the rules for these stories. Yeah, I'm talking to you, guy, who left a less than favorable review on iTunes. Now, these are tales from my couch, I guess. Enjoy, and I'll be back soon and more powerful than ever as soon as Mama's chicken soup is done. Warning. The following story contains depictions of human gore. Don't touch the pipes. From Dr. M. I'm an engineer for a small company in Houston, Texas. If you're from here, you know about the popularity of oil rig jobs and the corresponding engineering jobs that take up a large portion of our economy. However, engineers and oil rig jobs aren't the only ones in the industry. We also have guys known as service techs who help us run tests on parts, go out and use the parts in the wells, and help us give feedback on what works and what doesn't. During one part test, we were flown out via helicopter to a well to observe the experiment firsthand. A service tech was present to put it on the drill string. This particular rig is located in the Gulf of Mexico, a few hours south of Texas. I'd never actually been to a rig until this point. Ironic since I'm an engineer that designs parts for them, and I looked around in awe, soaking up the scenery and looking off the side of the rig into the intimidating ocean below. It was really freaky looking into the water, watching the massive waves crash into the floating rig platform. However, that would be far from the scariest thing I'd see that day. Once I got through soaking in my new environment, I was called to deck to oversee the part test. A piece of machinery designed to protect and provide slip to the drill pipe down the hole. These parts are most often put on manually by service techs, as they are specifically trained in drill string attachments and safety. Now, to preface, it's not uncommon for service techs to chat with each other while on the job, assuming they could hear each other over the loud machinery. They do this job day in and day out, with very little break time, so distraction is not unheard of or even uncommon. However, I wish that it was. When the test commenced, the Kelly began to move. The Kelly is a type of well drilling device on an oil or gas drilling rig that employs a section of pipe which passes through the matching splined Kelly bushing and rotary table. The Kelly moved closer and closer to the platform, anticipating a new section of pipe to be added. This is all normal, as pipe is added in increments as the Kelly undulates, allowing the moving pieces to be added or removed by discretion of the driller. However, the tech assigned to this experiment was busy trying to get the attention of another colleague, looking away momentarily as he was aiding in placing the pipe along the drill string and securing the protector. While he was looking away, the protector clamped over his hand tightly, the locking mechanism already in position and headed toward the narrow canal in the platform. The screams erupted on deck as workers frantically lunged for the emergency shutoff buttons, but it was already too late. The protector had successfully made its way to the canal, pulling his hand and arm up to his elbow into the floor before anyone could have realized what happened. After several agonizing seconds, the drill string finally stopped with a shuddering metal groan. I stood, frozen in my spot, sweat pooling in my boots and under my hard hat. I turned around and tore my safety glasses and mask off my face, vomiting into the grease waste bin. His arm was mangled and twisted so that the bone was sticking out at odd angles and unnaturally flattened by the crushing force of the drill string in the floor. Feeling like I was going to pass out, I had a colleague escort me to the lower deck so I could sip some water and regain my bearings. I removed my boots and put my feet against the wall, propping them over my head to prevent my lightheadedness from overtaking me. I could still hear the screams, the sobs from the man in the deck above, making it all that much more difficult to keep my composure. However, my composure that I fought so hard to keep would soon drain out of me like leaking oil when they brought the man through the room I was in to get him to the infirmary. Carried by a backboard, he was brought through the break room screaming and bleeding. I watched as they carried him by, his mangled and severed arm gushing blood. I squeezed my eyes shut as tight as I could, trying not to vomit, while I was practically upside down, still trying to keep the blood flow to my head and not pass out. I could feel my skin prickling and going pale, that cold, creeping feeling that you get when you know you're about to lose consciousness. I sat up, bringing my knees to my chest, trying to keep my head from swimming. However, when I woke up on the floor, I realized that I had passed out anyway, despite my efforts. When I was brought to the infirmary for an aspirin and ice pack for my head, I couldn't help but stare at the blood everywhere, left by the man whose arm was taken by the rig. I ended up getting sent home that day, unable to finish the experiment and go back to that platform after watching it tear the man's arm right off. Even though I got flack from my employer for not finishing the experiment, I don't regret it. I'm just glad I didn't have to spend another moment on a platform that ripped off another person's limb. If you work on oil rigs, please always pay attention and remain alert on the platform. Whatever you do, don't touch the pipes. Never walk nights alone and unarmed. From Monica. This encounter happened when I was 22 years old. At the time, I was 5 months pregnant, working at a Yoshinoya food chain restaurant. I would always work the night/graveyard shifts, and this took place in Los Angeles, California. I was walking home one night around 10:30 or 11 p.m. It was already dark out, and the streets were almost empty. Luckily, I only lived a 3-minute walking distance from Yoshinoya, so I always felt safe. My husband would usually pick me up, but often he fell asleep due to his work schedule and our 1-year-old son. I was very impatient, and I just wanted to get home and rest. So instead of waiting, I would begin walking, because by the time he got up and started the car, I would practically be home already. The street I had to walk through was the main street with a large grocery market on the way. There was an even darker small section I would pass through. As I got closer, I saw this white van with no windows in the back, so just 2 passenger windows and a windshield. The entire area was darkened due to large trees nearby. I was getting extremely nervous because this was just out of the ordinary. It got worse when I saw a man standing outside of the same van smoking a cigarette, with his back and one leg against the van. It's hard to explain the fear that came over me because I was very tired and even more uncomfortable. It was even worse because I was pregnant. I kept thinking, what would happen to my child if something happens here? I could not see the man's face clearly because it was too dark. As I was approaching, I thought to myself, this guy's gonna grab me and throw me into that van. I can feel it in my gut. But to my relief, nothing happened. As soon as I turned to walk into the alley, I started running as fast as I could. I was halfway through the alley when I turned around, and I saw that man now walking behind me. He was looking back and around, sort of an uncomfortable and unsure body language coming from him. Luckily, as I approached my apartment complex, some neighbors were downstairs drinking. A wave of relief came to me again. As I stopped running and made the turn into the apartment parking lot, I saw the suspicious man retreating back the way he came. I was so terrified to walk alone at night after that. Due to my work schedule, I had to continue this routine for several more months. Fortunately, I never saw that van or man again, and I'm very thankful for it to this day. In the end, it seemed like that man was in turmoil with himself. Perhaps he was planning to take me, but he had decided against it. I'll never know for sure.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
You know, I might have a rough job from time to time, serving mediocre coffee and shooing away the occasional werewolf hobos from the side of the store here at Dead and Roasted. But I will tell you, I'm glad I'm not in the army. Grueling training, deadly shootouts, coming back with PTSD, not to mention the mutants. However, while I'm on my break today, I do have a few news stories for you. One about the horrors of war, one about mutants on a military base, and one about those that come back in the dark corners of a hospital. Grab your double espresso and strap in. These stories will scare you, make you laugh, or even depress you at times. After all, these are tales from the break room. Where's that light coming from? From Jason R. After completing boot camp in the summer of 1991, I was sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for my advanced individual training. Whereas boot camp teaches you how to be a soldier, AIT teaches you the job you'll be doing in the Army. My particular MOS was 45K10, a tank turret repairer. To be honest, I don't remember how long I was at Aberdeen. Cut me some slack. It's been 30 years. But there is one thing I remember with crystal clarity, and it had nothing to do with fixing tanks. As a private, you live a life of crap. Flinging dirt, raising flags, and pointless guard assignments were all just parts of life. There was one particular sight that caused some guys to be uneasy. All these bravely macho morons thought something bad was out there. I'd pulled duty there before and thought they were full of crap. There was a bunch of surplus junk strewn out all about Hell's Half Acre. Off to the right of the main building was a patch of woodland where, well, I'll get back to that in a minute. Aberdeen is a nasty place, and I don't mean it's unkempt. Every sort of toxic substance one can imagine has been or is currently stored there. Toxic gases, nerve agents, hell, even the M1A1 Abrams used a particularly nasty hydraulic fluid. Now that might not sound so bad, but FRH, as it's called, can cause everything from blindness to sterility to, in my case, epilepsy. Yes, I'm a disabled vet, and my disability was probably caused by me being frequently drenched in FRH. I say probably because Aberdeen Proving Ground was also home to some radiological materials as well. God only knows what caused me to get as messed up as I am. Grand mal seizures are buckets of fun, let me tell you. Anyway, now that I've completed my pity parade, I'll tell you about something else that also got messed up at Aberdeen. The deer. Guys had told me about 8-legged frogs and all kinds of other weird crap out there. I'd never seen anything, but to be fair, Aberdeen Proving Ground is 70k plus acres. A lot of stuff can be hiding out there. There were 2 other guys with me, another private named Richie. He was a Vanilla Ice wannabe. Again, we're talking about the 90s. He thought he was a lot hipper than everyone else. He was alright, I guess. Neither one of us wanted to be there, and we spent the first hour or so complaining about how damned cold it was. What are we supposed to be protecting out here? How the hell should I know? What am I, our squad leader or class? Shut up, you two. I think I heard something. This came from Specialist Third Guy. I don't remember his name, so we'll keep it as Third Guy. I think Third Guy was going through AIT again, as he was changing his MOS. I can't recall exactly. Anyway, he was the really annoying part of the evening. Richie and I were both young and stupid. This guy was just stupid. Out of nowhere, he ran off chasing someone he thought he saw. Richie and I figured he was trying to scare us. Rather than follow him, we just sat there and waited for our relief to show up. Safety is everything in the army, I write as I laugh myself hoarse. And naturally, the only light we had available came from a nearby street lamp. We couldn't see jack, and both of us were hoping the boredom would be broken by the sound of Third Guy screaming because he'd fallen and broken his ankle. No such luck. Within a few minutes, he came back and said he was sure he saw something, but it didn't look like a person. He was acting kind of strange. He wasn't treating us like newbies anymore. It's a pretty sad state of affairs when you realize something might be wrong by someone not being a pain. Did you guys see anything weird? Maybe a Hummer came by and shined its lights over there. Richie wasn't having it. Man, we haven't seen crap. Realizing we were done with his nonsense, he downshifted a bit. Has our relief arrived? It was my turn to be annoyed. Dude, if our relief arrived, we would have let you F around out there and gone back to the barracks. Then, all 3 of us heard a twig snap. But he was the only one to react. There was all manner of oil drums that had been used to contain something other than oil. Water buffaloes, etc., scattered everywhere. Some of the stuff wasn't painted OD green, some of it was white. Having driven past the place on a number of occasions, we knew what was out past the tree line. We couldn't see any of the junk that was painted white because it was too dark. But we all could see something. This isn't part of the story where I claim that everything fell silent. We could very well hear crickets and other things making noise. There was another snap, which let us know where to look. When we looked, it was a deer. We could see it because, well, this deer, I kid you not, was glowing. I can say this because the light it was giving off lit up the branches above it, as well as a piece of equipment in front of it. What in the world? I muttered. Now, before anyone says I saw a Wendigo, keep in mind the depictions of a Wendigo with horns come from movies. So no, this wasn't a Wendigo, it was just a deer, doing normal deer things. You know, like glowing in the dark. We just sat there watching this thing walk quietly through the trees, dipping its head every now and then to eat grass, or perhaps uranium. I told you, You didn't tell us anything, Richie said, not taking his eyes off the beast. Realizing he hadn't, third guy shut up. Whenever it got close enough for us to get a better look at it, we noticed it wasn't right. I don't quite know how to explain it. I mean, a deer's eyes reflect light whenever a light hits them, but this thing's eyes never stopped shining, and its fur was all clumpy. It had patches of fur that were long near its shoulders and rump, and it didn't seem at all to be afraid of us. This thing wandered in and out of the woods for like 10 minutes. Then our relief finally decided it was a good time to make an appearance. Then we realized something else. It wasn't alone. Back off in the trees were several normal deer who got spooked and darted off when they heard the rumble of the Hummer's engine. But old Whitey didn't seem to be scared. It left, but it did so at its own pace. Richie, ever the blabbermouth, grabbed one of the guys coming on shift and pointed at it. I know what you're thinking, that this is the part where it just disappeared. No. In fact, all of us saw old Whitey out there. One or two of the normal deer and another weird deer in the back. Like I said, you couldn't see much back in those woods, but the Hummer's lights revealed that there was another one back a bit further. It wasn't glowing, it was just white. My guess, or hope, is that it was albino. When I was discharged 6 years later, the docs tried to convince me the Army hadn't caused my epilepsy. I promptly told them I'd be getting a second opinion from a civilian doctor and a lawyer. Their tone changed, but they downplayed it as much as possible. Now, this was a young doctor, and I doubted she'd seen much of anything outside of a troop medical clinic. At one point, she got huffy and made a comment that I was exaggerating my condition. I had to stop myself from paraphrasing Winston Zeddemor's line from Ghostbusters. Lady, I've seen shit that'll turn you white. Wheelchair Collector. From Alex. When I was in high school, my mom worked at a hospital, and every summer until I went to college, she signed me up for their volunteer program. For those of you who may not know, volunteering is kind of like having a job and they don't pay you. They do, however, pay you with meal vouchers and invaluable experience that you can then put on all your future college and job applications. Putting the sarcasm aside, volunteering did help me when I started to apply for real jobs. Having some customer service experience and time management skills beat out someone with no experience most of the time. And I'll always be grateful to the very nice women in the patient registration department that I worked with. I'll never know how they all managed to stay so calm when dealing with so many people every day, day after day, and week after week. I think it's fair to say that patient registration is like the mouth of hell. Everyone entering the hospital for any sort of procedure, MRIs, colonoscopies, or stress tests, has to be processed through the registration department. And even back then, years before the pandemic, it was sometimes a crowded and miserably long wait. That's why volunteers were so important, to help keep the line moving. We were tasked with photocopying insurance cards, giving patients forms to read or fill out while they waited, and escorting people to where their appointments were. Even though it wasn't a big hospital, it had a confusing layout. There were 2 separate towers and 5 sets of elevators that were very hard to describe to people without discombobulating them. Yes, go straight ahead through the glass doors, and then on your right, there are 4 elevators that will take you to the 7th floor where imaging is the 3rd floor on the left side. Or, oh no, don't take the elevators next to the cafeteria. They only go to our floor, the main floor, and then to the parking lot and basement. Yeah, no, that's all way too confusing for most people, just trying to make it to their appointment on time. For the many elderly that frequented our hospital, it was almost cruel to give them a lot of directions they could barely hear, then send them on their way. If there was more than one of us volunteers, it was easy to take turns walking with patients to their destinations. But most of the time, there was only one of us there. So when it was really busy, there was just a relentless back and forth cycle you had to run between the elevators and doctors' offices. What made the busy days especially difficult was when there was more than one patient that required the use of a wheelchair. I'm not blaming the patients. I'm merely commenting on the limited number of wheelchairs we had available. Our department only had 3 permanently assigned to us, and just like shopping carts in a grocery store, most people didn't return them right away, or where they were supposed to. So when a patient needed one and we didn't have any around, it always fell to the volunteers to quickly jog, never run, around the hospital to go wheelchair hunting. Being a consistent volunteer, I quickly learned that the valet and ER were usually great spots to find one in a hurry. But when they turned up empty, the only other place to check was in the parking garage. If patient registration was the mouth of hell, then the parking garage was definitely the bowels. It wasn't just one big thing that was off-putting about the parking garage, but a collection of many small things that, over time, made you feel completely unwelcome in the place. While they cleaned the floors every few months, the maintenance crew never seemed to get around to dusting the exposed pipes which veined the concrete ceilings, or change the flickering fluorescent lights, until the doctors who were driving around in their nice cars started complaining. Sometimes I think the creepy factor was enhanced because it was an underground parking lot. With no natural lighting and a serpentine design, there was an endless sense to the space. Like if you didn't know where the elevators were, you could aimlessly wander down there forever, not knowing if it was night or day. The air was always a little too stagnant as well. Not disgusting or dirty, but just heavy with the fumes of car exhaust, dusty old equipment, and stale unwashed linens. On lucky days, I'd be able to find 1 or 2 wheelchairs right in front of the elevator doors, and on bad days, I'd have to walk past the storage staging area that set towards the back of the garage. Since it was a storage area, the light in there was never on, but you could see empty hospital beds crowded together waiting to be fixed. I'm not sure if it's common for hospital beds to require maintenance that often, but that area always seemed to have 3 or more beds, just waiting quietly in the dark. I absolutely hated walking past that storage area. Even though I knew better, I always felt as if there were people lying in those beds, and something bad would happen to me if I looked at them directly. So whenever I had to cross the path, I looked at the ground or made it a game to look at the license plates of cars that were parked nearby. But it happened one day. One morning, an elderly woman, who probably shouldn't have been driving, accelerated instead of braking into her parking space. The front of her car was damaged, but the woman, besides being a nervous wreck, was okay. I remember when she was wheeled into the lobby and rushed through patient registration, her hands were still shaking. I didn't mean to, but when I was wheeling her to her appointment, I overheard her telling her son that she had been distracted by someone she saw next to her car, that when she was pulling into her stall, she got scared because she thought she saw someone sitting in one of the hospital beds in the dark. And instead of braking, she kept her foot on the wrong pedal. Needless to say, I had a hard time concentrating for the rest of the day, and when my shift was over and I was in the car with my mom, we drove past that storage area. Sure enough, there was broken glass on the ground in the parking space closest to that horrible dark corner. I couldn't bring myself to look at it as we drove by. I still wonder, though, if I had been brave enough, curious enough, would I have seen what that old woman saw? A person who shouldn't be there, someone from beyond death, still sitting in their hospital bed. Overcoming Fear on the Battlefield, from Unatoned. Like all great military stories that begin with, "Well, there I was," let's assume you asked me about the most scared I've ever been while deployed. When people find out I was in the army and had been in combat, often their first question is either, "Did you kill anyone?" or "Was it scary to be in combat?" Typically, I try to deviate from that first question. Killing or injuring someone is nothing to brag about. Admitting fear, though, I find to be okay and a healthy way of processing things. Though early on after deployment, I would act like I never was scared. But that was a lie. If I'm being completely honest, the fear really didn't hit me when the bullets were flying. Instead, it hit after the fact, when everything was over, when you've got time to think in real time about what just happened. That's where the fear can creep into your head, when you've got time to think. So there I was, on my first deployment in Afghanistan. We were doing our usual meet and greet patrol, winning the hearts and minds of people who hate us and wanted us out of their daily lives. Nothing out of the norm. Roll into a village, disrupt the daily lives of people, get lied to, and go back to our outpost for some R&R. On our way back to the outpost, we were accosted by a young boy, no older than 10. He was screaming something in his native Pashto, which admittedly none of us could understand even a lick of. That's why we always had an interpreter along with us. Our interpreter was able to calm the kid down and find out what the problem was. The boy claimed that he escaped Taliban captivity where he was being abused sexually. We'd always heard this was something the Taliban liked to do, but also thought maybe it was a myth or a joke to us soldiers to dehumanize our enemies. Immediately, this felt odd and we were on guard. We weren't in a great ambush spot, as we were in an open field with at least 2,000 meters between the village we just left and the next village we'd passed through. Though we did have a sniper take a few shots at us in the area previous, we felt like we could be being set up. The Taliban were notorious for using children as a distraction while setting up an ambush. Quickly, our platoon leader made the decision to take this kid back with us and take him to be checked by the battalion surgeon to see if he was telling the truth. The kid claimed he would show us where these guys were staying, describing the compound and how many there were. That odd feeling when we encountered the boy had washed away after getting back to the outpost without further incident. Fast forward a bit, this boy was indeed telling the truth about being sexually abused. Plans were made to conduct a raid on the alleged compound the next night. Being on my first deployment, I thought, cool, we get to go on the offensive. Typically, we'd walk around waiting to be engaged by the enemy. You see, our enemies over there were not easily identifiable unless they were shooting at us. They can drop their AK and blend back into society, acting like a poor farmer within seconds. So the chance to go into a situation knowing who and where the enemies were was something I relished. It became concerning when my team leader and I were discussing the circumstances surrounding the mission. He was on his third deployment, once in Iraq and now twice in Afghanistan. He was a seasoned veteran with a lot of experience under his belt. Long story short, he, along with some of our other leaders in the platoon, had a bad feeling, like we were being set up. Because of the Taliban's nature to use children, this could all be part of an elaborate plan to lure us into their territory. Well, me being a done-nothing private, I wasn't going to argue with them. By the time we were preparing to leave for the mission that night, there was a very somber feeling in the platoon tent, one that I'd never felt. Even after we had a guy wounded, the atmosphere never felt this heavy. That little hint of doubt that our leaders probably did not intend to inject in our heads, but rather was intended to serve as a hey, be on guard, this smells funny type of warning, had spread, and none of us felt good about this raid. We had about an hour walk to our target building, one which felt a lot longer than it actually was. The conflict in my head about the mission weighed heavy, and I spent a lot of energy fighting this fear that was looming. I wish I could say that I was able to push the fear aside and focus on my role that lay ahead, but that wasn't the case. We got within 300 meters of the alleged building where this boy's abusers were staying, and the kid began to start acting really nervous. Our pace slowed to a crawl as the boy was growing more fearful with each step. We took up a defensive position while our platoon sergeant and platoon leader discussed what to do. Of course, I wasn't privy to be in on the conversation, but someone said we might be turning around because of the boy's sudden behavioral change. I would later find out that his behavior had spooked our platoon leader, and the thought that we might be getting set up was a real possibility. That was something that was being considered while the mission was planned, but even this boy's reaction had come as a surprise. Seeing battle-hardened men spooked like this was more than a surprise to me. But I saw both sides of thought here. The boy was obviously traumatized, and it took guts to escape and then return to his place of trauma. Or he could be nervous because he knows he's leading us into a trap. The entire premise of this mission was that they wouldn't be expecting us. hence why we were doing it at night. We had the element of surprise on our side, if this wasn't a setup. We gathered ourselves after leadership decided to proceed with the mission, but it was the lack of confidence in how this was relayed that got to me. My team leader, a battle-tested and proven soldier, had a fear in his voice that I'd never heard before. He reiterated our team's role in the raid in a way that a eulogy might be read. Myself and my other 2 roommates took pause for a moment, looking at each other with "what the hell" looks, and we shook our heads nonchalantly, as if to say, well, we're screwed. At this point, if you could read our minds, I think we were all thinking we were walking into death. At least, I was. We had no choice but to suck it up and face our fears. One mistake on my part, or anyone else's part, could end up costing the life or lives of others. I never had time to consider fear and anxiety before a mission. The consideration for things going wrong was always accounted for, so we never really dwelled on that. We trained hard, so that there was no thinking involved when crap hit the fan. All it takes is 1 ounce of doubt, then fear and anxiety can irrationally take control. Thankfully, the rest of the mission went mostly as planned, and without incident. Our training kicked in, and I'm alive today to talk about it, as well as everyone else who took part in it. Perhaps if we decided the mission was too big of a risk and turned around, I wouldn't have this lesson on how to deal with fear and anxiety today. It's easy to get caught up in the what-ifs of a situation. Sometimes you just have to suck it up and push through the fear whether you want to or not.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Welcome back to Dead and Roasted. Sorry, I'm not taking any new orders at the moment. I'm on break. Actually, you're a customer, so why are you in the employee lounge? You, didn't see our Thunder Bucket, did you? No matter. Don't pay any mind to what I just said. Instead, I know a good way to scare you away from sneaking into the employee lounge for good. A nice little scary work story. You know, drives to work are always long, leaving your comfortable home on a journey to an uncomfortable place, all the while contemplating your life decisions. However, according to this allegedly true story someone shared with me, this employee's drive to work became quite the nightmare. Enjoy this tale from the break room. The Longest Drive to Work, from Bailey F. This story happened to me a few years ago, so the details may be a bit shaky, and I apologize for that. At the time, I was working at a bakery across town from me. The drive there, or from there to home, would usually take anywhere from 30 minutes to sometimes 40 or even 50 if traffic was really bad that day. Because of this, I always tried to get to work a little early, as I'd rather be there early than late. So I woke up very early to get started, well before I needed to, in case anything came up on those mornings. Usually, I would wake up around 4 a.m., take a hot shower or cold shower depending on the temperature and how awake I was. Then I would sit in the living room and silently eat to not wake up my family. For the most part, I enjoyed these mornings. I'd usually listen to true crime or supposedly true horror stories while I got ready. With how dark it always was when I would do this, it really fit the mood. That day, I remember taking an extra long time in the shower, as I was dreading going to work. A bit because I was sick, so the steam was really helping me out, and a bit from just sheer exhaustion from the day before. Winter season was always way too busy for the amount of employees we had. I remember hopping out when my "you're gonna be late if you don't get moving" timer went off. I scarfed down my breakfast, and I honestly can't remember what it even was. Then I packed my lunch and got into my car. At that point, my "seriously get a move on" timer and my "you're going to be late" timer went off. Still, I wasn't in the mood to care all too much about being late. I didn't like it, but they'd been working us to the bone, so I thought it wouldn't be too big of a deal if I were a couple of minutes late, I found a YouTube video to listen to on my way to work, probably around 30 to 40 minutes long, which meant if the whole thing had played, it'd mean I was very late at that point. Pressing play, I started my car, let the windows defrost, which cut into my time even more. I was never good at judging how long windows take to defrost, and then I was off. Traffic was worse than I'd expected, but thinking back, I really should have considered how busy it'd be that close to Christmas. So much last-minute shopping and people leaving for trips all at once. I waited at a stop sign for the other cars to go, and I looked at my phone. I was about 10 minutes into my video, which meant I'd probably be about 10 to 15 minutes late to work. I sighed and tried to think happier thoughts. Then I continued on my way once I was good to keep driving. I was anxious and stressed by the time I was halfway through the drive. If my internal clock was right, which it usually was, my shift was about to begin. I remember becoming really stressed at this idea, and I had to do some breathing exercises at stoplights to try to calm myself down a bit. The whole situation at that point felt like a bad dream, and I was wishing I could have just been at work already, so I wouldn't be in trouble. I remember then I took the left needed to get to work, and I was surprised I was the only car turning left then. I looked into my rearview mirror and saw that I was actually alone on this road. I decided I would start doing some speeding to try to get to work on time. A dumb idea, I know. I was already late by then. I started driving like an insane person on top of that. Not exactly my best moment, but I really didn't want to get in trouble at work. The road was empty besides me, and I was probably going at around 80 miles per hour. Which, looking back on it, I seriously regret. I could have gotten myself or someone else hurt if the strange event that occurred didn't happen. I even ran 2 red lights, which seriously I cannot emphasize just how stupid I was being that day. Soon I was on the last stretch of road before I'd be able to turn into the parking lot. This stretch of road is pretty long and usually extremely busy. But for some reason, it was just as empty as the rest of the roads had been up to this point after I took the left. I pressed my foot down on the gas and began hauling even faster. The trees on the side of the road whipped by in a blur. I soon expected the next stoplight, but it never came. I basically froze up while driving, my foot still pressed on the gas, not as hard and not as fast. The road just continued on. I remember wondering, had I missed my turn? I panicked for a moment, thinking in my road rage I'd missed where I was supposed to turn. I looked around, seeing I was still on an empty road. Then I pulled my phone up and opened maps, and nothing. Just a white void with my little blue dot floating in the middle. I wasn't sure what was going on, so I made an illegal U-turn and started heading back the way I came. I was thinking I must have driven further than I meant to, that I was out of range for my cell phone or something. But again, as I sped down the road, it never ended. No stoplights or signs anywhere, just an endless lane of trees and a few old houses here and there. I drove for a bit longer before pulling up my phone again. I checked maps, thinking I must have gotten closer to town by now. But still, just a white void with my lone blue dot floating there. No roads, no shops, and none of my marked locations. Where was I? I went over to my text messages and decided to call my girlfriend. I tapped on her icon, then pressed call. I pressed speaker and waited to get a hold of her. My driving at this point had slowed way down. I was expecting a busy signal or to get her voicemail, but instead I was greeted with a "The number you have called has been disconnected" message. This was really odd to me. She had just gotten a new phone, so I doubted she changed her number again so soon. I figured something was just weird, and I called again. But I was greeted with the same message. Frustrated, I pulled over to the side of the road, and I called again. But still nothing, just that pre-recorded message mocking me. It was then that I noticed the time on my phone. 7:30 a.m., right when my shift started. I remember being very confused by this, as I was almost sure it was 7:30 halfway through my drive when I had taken that left turn. I waited and stared at the clock on my phone in bewilderment. I then watched as a minute passed. It flickered 7:31 a.m. for only a moment before returning right to 7:30 a.m. I either spoke out loud or maybe was thinking, what the heck, when that happened. I just watched the clock again for an entire minute, not sure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But sure enough, after a minute, my phone clock teased me again, saying 7:31 before immediately returning to 7:30. I tried to concentrate on something else, as that was hurting my brain, trying to understand what was happening. I stepped out of my car, dialing my dad's number instead, hoping maybe it was just my girlfriend's phone that I couldn't reach. I held my phone up high as it rang. Then I heard a click. Excited, I pulled my phone back down. "Dad?" I exclaimed. "The number you have called has been disconnected." That same voice greeted me with that message. I'm not sure if I blacked out or was just frozen in shock for a bit. But when I came to, my phone was on the ground, and I was just standing next to my car, my eyes watering a bit. I reached down, pocketing my phone, and got back in my car. I remember taking a deep breath before beginning my breathing exercise my therapist worked with me on. Then I started going down the road again. At this point, I figured I must have just been outside of town. Maybe I'd gotten road hypnosis and lost track of time. I also figured it was just my phone acting weird, that my girlfriend's and dad's numbers were fine. I continued down the road at a much slower pace, trying to make out where I was exactly. I continued my breathing exercise. At this point, I was sure that if I was able to receive calls, my work was calling me confused as to where I was, probably trying to call my seemingly broken phone. But I was much more concerned at this point as to where I was. All I was seeing was an endless road of trees and houses all built nearly identically, and still no stoplight or signs anywhere. I figured I would have run into something else at this point, especially with me heading back in the direction I came from. But no, I can still remember the seemingly never-ending expanse of trees with houses sprinkled throughout. At first, I was just tearing up from frustration, but at that point, I was crying out of fear and panic. I could not figure out where I was. I felt lost, like a child who lost their parents in a grocery store. My heart was racing as I looked around more and more frantically as I drove. I started to say, at least I think I was speaking, what I was seeing. I remember the order all too well to this day. Trees, red brick house, trees, boulder, greenhouse, trees, old dead tree, adobe house, trees, red brick house, trees, boulder, greenhouse, trees, old dead tree, adobe house, tree, red brick house. I remember that's when something clicked. Trees, boulder, greenhouse, tree. My voice was quivering at this point. Old tree, adobe, trees, red brick house. I began to cry loudly. It was all the same, a repeating pattern. I noticed the trees were all the same at this point too. The same small twisted patch of them outside every red house, the same cactus in front of the adobe house. It was all the same. I slammed on my brakes in the middle of the road, accidentally slamming my head on the steering wheel and honking the horn. I continued weeping, digging into my pocket for my phone. 7:30 a.m., I read as I unlocked it. Again, I tried to call someone, anyone. I clicked on each contact, crying as I did. Please pick up, please. I begged with each one. I would scream no every time I was greeted with that same mechanical, "The number you have called has been disconnected." I screamed into the void, my throat going hoarse. I looked around myself. I realized I was still in the middle of the road. It felt wrong. Even though at this point I knew no other car was coming along, I pulled over to the side of the road again and just broke down. I called my girlfriend over and over again, begging her to pick up, to answer the phone, to somehow reach me in all of this. I sent text after text, every one of them failing to send. I didn't know what to do. My breathing was staggered. I was practically just hyperventilating. I tried my best to do my breathing exercises, but so often deep breaths would be followed by more crying and screaming. I was scared, not sure what to do, and I couldn't think straight. I don't know how long I sat in my car for. I kind of just zoned out. I was in and out of fits of panic and sadness. I cried so much I no longer had tears. I racked my brain with countless ideas of what could be happening. Maybe I was in a nightmare. Maybe I hadn't actually awakened yet. Maybe I was just that lost and everything was a coincidence. I still had no clue what to do. Should I get out and look around? Should I just wait to wake up from this dream? Should I keep driving? After a moment of trying to think as clearly as I could, I decided to get out of my car and investigate further. I stepped out and looked down the road, nervously walking into the middle of the road and looking down either direction. I pushed myself onto my tiptoes to see further. From what I could tell, there wasn't anyone near me. No one coming, no one going past my car. I walked back to my car and carefully got onto the top of it, making sure not to accidentally shatter or crack the glass. Again, I pushed myself up onto my tiptoes and gazed down the empty street. In either direction, there was nothing. Just more roads, more houses. Then a thought struck my mind. I raised up my hand, and sure enough I could make out my fingertips extending into the air in front of me, and then behind me as well. I hopped down, turning off my car, pulling the parking brake, and making sure I had my phone, wallet, and keys. I locked the car and jogged forward. It took a while to run the distance I'd been seeing over and over again. Once more, I named off the landmarks as I went. Trees, boulder, greenhouse, more trees, dead tree, adobe house, even more trees, red brick house. Then I saw it. My car, I said. I began to approach the same vehicle I had just gotten out of a bit ago. I walked over, jamming my key into the lock and turned it. It made the unlocking sound, and I was able to open it. I remember cursing under my breath and sitting down in the dirt right where my car door was, just taking in the entire situation. I had driven for a long time, getting nowhere. I was completely alone, and the world around me seemed to be repeating itself. I left my car and walked in one direction away from it, and yet still ended up back at it. I felt myself losing concentration on the whole world again. I felt like zoning out, like going to sleep and waking up to the normal world again. I hopped back into my car, started her up, and I peeled out of the dirt and began to speed down the road. This time, I hit close to 100 miles per hour. The world around me blurred into nothing but shapes. I kept my foot pressed down on the pedal for what felt like hours, never running out of gas, never once seeing another car. The world just a blur of green, black, and brown as the road, the dirt, and the trees zoomed past and under me. Eventually, I did slow down again. I think I was screaming during the whole thing. I remember desperately drinking my water I'd brought to take to work to help wet my throat again. I parked my car and slammed the door shut behind me. I looked up at the cloudy gray sky and screamed until I lost my voice. What few tears I had left dropped down my face as I refused to accept this fate. There I knelt in the middle of the road, just staring into the cloudy abyss above me. Maybe for only a minute or maybe even more hours passed, I don't know. I couldn't tell time anymore. Every time I checked, it was just always 7:30. Eventually, I got up and walked back to my car. I kicked a tire and silently screamed, little more than raspy air escaping at that point. No amount of breathing exercises would help. I now just existed in a constant state of panic, not sure where to go, where I even could go, or what to try next. I sat back in my car, slamming the door again and just looking out the window, probably with a glazed over look in my eyes. I flicked the turn signal on and off, just something to keep my hands busy as my mind raced. It took a while, but I came to an idea. Not something to do to get out of this, but just to pass the time. I decided to walk to one of the houses. I got out of the car again, trampling through the brush towards the red brick house, pushing bushes and small trees out of my way as I went. This house looked old, not necessarily run down, but on its way, definitely abandoned. The curtains were drawn, so I wasn't able to peek inside at all. I pressed the doorbell, but I don't think it worked. Then I tried knocking, hoping someone would hear my mostly lost voice as I spoke as loudly as I could. "Hello, is anyone home?" Though it was barely even a sentence by the time it actually came out. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Then I knocked a few more times before having another look around. There was a car parked in the backyard, overgrown with cobwebs and plants. It looked as if it hadn't run in decades. No license plate or anything. I had decided to try the door handle, and surprisingly, it popped open. It smelled rancid in there, though, so I closed it back up and covered my nose. I peeked inside the car, but it just looked old and run down. Nothing out of the ordinary. Probably rats inside, I thought. I knocked on the back door of the house and tried to open it, but alas, it was locked too. I wandered back to my car, feeling a bit defeated, and decided to try another of the buildings. I drove down to the greenhouse. Its glass windows were shattered. This one was completely overrun by wildness, reclaimed by nature. Again, though, nothing looked of interest. Plus, I didn't want to risk falling into the glass lying about the building. Lastly, I went to the adobe house. I tried the door and it opened, but it was burnt to a crisp on the inside. Oddly enough, it still felt warm though, like the embers that burnt it were still hot. The floor crunched as I walked around in the ash. I was relieved when I didn't find any burnt bodies in the bedrooms. I spent some time in there, just taking in the sights. It had a haunting sort of beauty to it. By the time I got back to the car, it felt as if an entire day had passed. I decided to try to call everyone again, but still nothing. The sun still glowed from beyond the clouds in the same spot. The road was still empty, and I was still all alone. I walked the road again, always returning to my car in the middle of the road. I was curious as to how it worked exactly, but ultimately I just felt crazy trying to understand it, and I was exhausted. I didn't want to sleep here, not intentionally. That felt like giving up, like accepting what had happened to me. So I just drove for a bit to clear my head. I turned and drove back to the original direction I went. Slowly, calmly, just a still drive to have something to do. I drove for a while, trying to load up YouTube videos or music, and none of them would play. So I sang to myself as I drove, in my raspy and torn voice. I tried to enjoy myself, but I still found myself crying throughout. I wanted my family and friends back, to hold my girlfriend, to go to work and have a normal day, be back to my normal, boring life. But as I drove, I eventually caught a glimpse of something in the distance. Something caught my eye, a traffic light. I raced towards it, reinvigorated with hope, slamming my foot down hard, but no matter how many instances of the houses and trees I passed, it seemed to stay the same distance away. I wanted to give up at that point. The road had won, it had broken me. I began to laugh like a crazy person. I didn't know what to do, no reaction felt right other than to laugh. It was funny at the time. Somehow that traumatic and horrific moment was funny when I thought about it. Looking back now, it really wasn't, but in the moment I couldn't think of anything more hilarious. I stopped pressing on at some point. I think I was still laughing then. Eventually, I had one last-ditch effort come to mind. I put the car in reverse and drove backwards along the road. I went past the landmarks in reverse order. Then I looked up. I almost couldn't breathe. There was the stoplight. And suddenly another car honked at me. I looked behind and I was simply reversing at a green light. I slammed onto the brakes and put the car into drive. Somehow, the road continued as it normally should have, and I was able to pass those landmarks. My heart thudded as I passed the last one. Then a wave of relief washed over me as I spied my bakery up ahead. The road had finally continued on, like normal. I pulled into the parking lot in the back and sighed in relief, crying tears of joy. I grabbed my phone and looked at it. The video hadn't finished playing yet, and the time read 7:20 a.m. now. Despite everything, I was there early. I decided to just go to work that day, wanting everything to feel normal. I told my coworkers that some family drama was the reason I'd been crying, and I'd actually gotten to go home early that day because we were overstaffed, despite it being our busy season. I didn't tell anyone about it. My family doesn't really believe in those sorts of things, and my friends aren't much more of believers. But I thought this would be a good place to share it with more open-minded folks, with people who may have had similar supernatural experiences. Nothing like this has ever happened to me since, thankfully. If you ask me, I think I was caught in some weird time loop or glitch in the Matrix or something. I didn't believe in those at all before, thinking that people who posted and told such stories were just making them up. But after this happened to me, let's just say I believe differently now. However, I've also found it a lot harder to drive anymore. I didn't tell my therapist what really happened, in fear of her thinking I was crazy or something. But I told her instead that I'd gotten lost and ended up in a bad accident. I've since been diagnosed with PTSD from the quote-unquote accident.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Oh hey, welcome back to Dead and Roasted. I was just about to start my break. I definitely need it today. I popped my third kidney and needed a break to settle it back down. That's what I get for trying our new Brappuccino. That thing has a little too much kick. But you're just in time, because today I've got several new, scary, and allegedly true work stories from some of my acquaintances. I've got stories about horrors at hospitals, paranormal prisoners, and even one of my now all-time favorite stories about an old man with one terrifying swing. Get comfy, avoid those Brappuccinos, and enjoy these tales from the break room. Almost killed by a war veteran. From Hospitalmakeout. I work in a long-term care facility, a really big one with a full restaurant-style kitchen and housekeeping. I work NOCs, which means night shift, 10:30 p.m. to 8 a.m., no lunch included. Most nights we have a resident or two possibly up, but as the majority are completely with it and mobile, that really doesn't matter. Also, a lot of stuff happens at night, so that's kind of gross and something we have to keep in mind. Well, one night I was in the break room. It was about 2 a.m. and I just got done doing rounds. We go to check to see if any bed-bound people need changing. I was alone at the moment because my coworker was in the kitchen getting some food. The door to the break room, which had been slightly ajar, was thrown hard against the wall. My back was to it, so I turned around thinking my coworker came back and was trying to scare me. Nope. Instead, there stands an old man with a muscular build and a cane in the air. He had severe PTSD, sundowners, and dementia. He takes one look at me and yells, "I'm gonna beat you to death." My reaction was like, that doesn't sound fun. He slammed the cane down against our file cabinet. Suddenly I realize he's in the only exit, and all that's behind me is a small desk. He brings that cane down again, saying, "You messed with the wrong person." He brings the cane back up, preparing for another strike. He screams. I see just red in his eyes. I can feel the hand of God leaving me at that point. He starts to walk further into the room. I tell the guy, I just work here, I'm new. He replies,
That's the last lie you ever tell.
Then he brings the cane all the way back and break me in half position. Then my coworker appears behind him, chiming in, Hey, stop playing around and go to bed. He stops and looks, saying,
No, she needs to die.
Then my coworker replies, You can do that in the morning, okay? Go to bed. Suddenly, he stops. He turns around and walks away like I never existed in the first place. I'm standing there, my soul hiding under the desk, and my coworker looks me dead in the face, saying, You're new, that's all. It's been 5 years since then, and the sound of a cane against metal still scares me. He was nice as heck during the day, though, so I guess that's cool. It's not there. From Jonah R. Between 1999 and 2006, I served my community as a detention deputy. As you might imagine, I have a lot of stories, most of them neither fun nor funny. But there were a couple that were downright terrifying. I decided to become a jail guard when it was announced a jail would be opening up in my hometown. After I left the service, I'd only had a couple of part-time jobs. Not anything one would consider a career. During this time, I met a beautiful woman who agreed to become my wife. Working for tips as a waiter was not going to cut it anymore. So away I went to college to earn the right to wear a badge. Once I finished my training, I was off to jail, thankfully on the right side of the bars. When the new jail neared completion, the higher-ups decided to have a deputy stationed there to keep an eye on the place. If I could get that assignment, I'd get to work unsupervised and be 5 minutes away from my house. I couldn't raise my hand fast enough. Now that I think back on it, I wish I'd kept my hand down. The main part of the jail is laid out like a V, with dorms consistently placed on either side of the V, and master control was located at the base of the V. Master control is just what it sounds like. It's the room where primary access control is handled. After checking everything was in place, I settled in for the night. I had snacks, soda, a new book I was looking forward to reading. Keep in mind this was before the iPhone Wi-Fi era. Other than being bored to tears, I didn't have anything to worry about. Or so I thought. We were required to walk down the corridors and into each of the dorms every few hours. I never liked walking down the main corridors. All that empty space was unnerving. I know it's super cliche, but I always got the feeling someone was sitting up in the master control watching me walk around. It felt like someone back there was watching over me. Someone who wasn't actually there. I brushed it off, manned up, and did my rounds. One night I was halfway down the first corridor when I realized I hadn't unlocked the doors before I'd left master control. I groaned. That meant I'd have to unlock all the doors manually. Pop. The door to my left creaked open. Inside, I could hear the doors to each of the two dorms also open. What in the world? I thought. It was a new facility, and there were bound to be a few bugs, so I double-checked to make sure I had the master keys in my pocket before heading in to shut the inner doors and closing the main hallway door. It would have been kind of embarrassing if I locked myself in, especially for 12 hours. Checked and secured, I moved on. Pop, pop. This time it was the primary doors on both sides of the hallway. Just as they had before, the doors in front of me began to open. If something happens once, you can just blow it off, but if something happens twice, at exactly the precise time you're about to do something, that is not a coincidence. Meanwhile, I still felt those non-existent eyes crawling up the back of my neck. Working in law enforcement, in any capacity, can be a soul-sucking experience. You get used to ugly and scary, but this was a different kind of scary. I didn't know what the hell was going on. Like I said, the first time it happened, it was relatively easy to shake off. I figured they were using some sort of new motion-sensitive system or something. I called my supervisor the next day, asking him if that happened to be the case.
Nah, no way, man. We'd never use something like that.
After making it clear that was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard, think about having a motion-sensitive system in a jail for a minute. He asked me why I was asking. I made up something about noticing some equipment in the control rooms and wanting to know what they were. He scoffed.
You've taken the courses on how to operate those systems. Heck, you know more about how things work down there than I do.
I could feel the sarcasm pouring out of the phone. He could give me crap all he wanted so long as he saved me that 45-minute drive. The following night, I decided to wait a while before doing my rounds. I paid extra close attention to the CCTV cameras. This was back in the early 2000s and I was with a county agency, so we're not talking NSA-level tech here. I watched and after a while I finally cracked my book open. But then, the doors began opening again. I couldn't hear them opening. I first noticed it when I saw motion on the screens. My head yanked up to the sight of 3 doors slowly opening. I steeled myself, grabbing my keys and going down to close those doors. But things were different this time. Instead of just feeling someone watching me, I swear I saw movement in master control when I glanced back over my shoulder. Racing back, I was greeted to the sight of an empty room filled with mindlessly flickering screens. That day, keep in mind I worked 12-hour shifts at night, I dreamt I was in one of the dorms and I had a ring full of keys, but none of them would open any of the doors. Then the dream went on what I could only call endless desperation loop. I kept trying to get out using the keys, any of the keys, but none of them would open any of the doors. I was starting to get rattled. These sorts of events kept happening. As the day of the jail's opening drew closer, I started to believe there was someone living in that jail. Maybe a homeless person, desperate for a place to stay, had taken up residence there. But no matter how hard I searched, I could not find anyone. Finally, my time watching over the creepy place drew to a close. My last day, or rather my last night, finally came around. The sun began to warm the skies off in the horizon, and I could see the lights from the relief officer's car as he pulled into the parking lot.
It's not there.
The words had come out of nowhere and had been spoken directly into my ear. I jumped up, causing the chair to fly across the room. I rushed around, checking every screen of every monitor in the room. Nothing. So, what's going on? The oncoming officer asked me as he entered the room. I sighed. Nothing, I said, packing up my things and heading out. When you leave the control room, the entryway to the 2 main hallways is on the left, and the main exit is on the right. As there weren't any inmates in the facility yet, we left the hallway door open. As I stepped out, I stopped for a second to adjust the strap on my backpack. As I turned to leave, I heard someone say,
It's not there.
The words echoed down the halls. I quickly turned and looked up at the other officer to find him frantically looking over the monitors, down toward me and down the hallways. I didn't know if the other officers were playing a game on me, and the guy who just took over was in on it. So rather than get punked, I just gave him a wave and headed out. Whatever was going on, at least I knew it wasn't just me. Soon the jail was stocked full of alleged evildoers, and you couldn't hear yourself think, let alone some ethereal convict trying to find something he lost. Not long after that, I resigned, taking up a job with another sheriff's office. That was 20+ years ago, but even after all that time, I still think back on those days and shudder. Hospital Haunt from Mortis79. Some time ago, I went to school for nursing. When I graduated, I was hired by the same hospital that I did some of my clinicals at. I live in a small rural town, and this hospital has been around longer than me, about 70 or more years, I believe. I started working on the second floor of the hospital at first. There are 3 halls in front of the nurse's station, one to the left, one to the right, and one straight ahead. The second week I was at the nurse's station doing some charting when down the left hall that was straight ahead of my desk, I catch movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was the CNA getting vitals. Then I see what appears to be an older woman in an old-looking nurse's uniform, complete with the old nurse's cap, which we don't even wear anymore. I asked my friend, "Who is that?" He asked, "Who?" "The lady in the old white uniform." He looked at me funny. "Who told you?" I asked what he was talking about. He then explained to me, "We've all heard or seen the lady in white. She's been seen on all the floors. Nobody knows who she is." That was just the start of my experience with her. At one point, I went down the hall to check on my patients. At the end of the hallway, there is a room for families to sit and wait in for the doctor. I saw flashing lights, so we went to see what was going on. Through a window, I saw that there was a wreck down the road. Then the silence was broken by someone whispering in my ear, "Hey." I turned quickly, but when I looked, no one was there. A few months later, I would be moved to the 3rd floor. One day when the head RN, the security guard, and I were sitting in the nurse's office in a locked unit. We happened to look up, and we saw a black shadow walking down the hallway. I looked them to confirm if they saw it too. They replied yes, they definitely did. On another occasion, the RN was facing the monitor while I was talking to him. Suddenly, he said, "Well, she's up again. I'll go take care of her." He was referring to a patient with dementia who would often leave her room. As he turned around, there was no one there. He told me he swore he saw a woman come out of the room on camera, but when he checked again, she was sleeping and hadn't moved. The last encounter happened when an RN and I were talking at the nurse's station, and the med room door slammed shut. I went to open it and looked around, but of course it was empty. The RN pulled up her phone and started recording, saying, "If that was you, please do it again." At first, nothing happened. Then, slam, the door was slammed shut again. On that same floor, one night I was all alone, waiting in case we got some patients in. It was dark at the time, and I was at the nurse's station, bored, playing solitaire on the old computer. All of a sudden, all the call lights began going off. There was no one on the entire floor. I called my charge nurse and told her I was going home, that if we got a patient in, they could call me. She laughed and said that's fine. She too had had many experiences there. Working at that hospital, there were so many instances of feeling like you were being watched, or like you were being touched by someone that wasn't there. However, the entire time I worked there, it never felt threatening. I don't work there anymore, but sometimes I do miss the lady in white. Sounds you don't want to hear in a hospital. From Juli H. Back in the day, I used to work at a hospital for the rehabilitation department. The main department area that we were located at was where we'd sit to document and unwind after seeing patients. It was our escape from the usual, as well as the not-so-usual hospital chaos. Our safe space. Before the rehab department moved in, the area used to be labor and delivery, with a small offshoot for critical pediatrics. Over the years, some of my former coworkers would complain about doors suddenly slamming shut or random computers turning off when others kept working. A few certain individuals shared with me their experiences. Later into the evening one day, one speech pathologist heard crying in the hallway. It sounded like a small baby. She ran to go see if anyone needed some help. Once out there, she couldn't find anyone there, let alone what could have been the source of that crying. On her way back, though, she heard giggling. Then her door slammed shut, right in front of her. Another coworker, another speech pathologist, would hear the giggling and crying towards the evening. At that point, word had spread about the mysterious noises, so he didn't bother getting up. But as the cries and giggles were ignored, the doors would start to slam and computers began to act up, having problems. At one point, he swore that out of the corner of his eye, he saw small children looking at him near the doors. Over the years, as the department kept growing with more people, there was less opportunity for people to be by themselves. The whispers and sounds started to fade with time. Doors would still slam shut, but that became due to them being replaced and being able to open and close electronically. By the time I was hired, the stories were years old, and most of the older crew were retiring. The newer crowd had heard minor sounds, but waved it away as sounds of the hospital. It was just silly ghost stories to unnerve the younger people. After all, some said, it was the speech pathologists that had issues, then they would laugh. But the older crew that stayed on remembered the whispers, the giggles, the cries. They remembered the doors slamming shut. The exceptional few remembered the children staring, just out of the corner of their eyes. Just enough in view to remind them, in that frigidly cold, seemingly empty room, they were not alone. They were never alone, and perhaps they would never be alone again. Child on the Bridge, from Foxx. It was 2 years ago. I had just gotten done with my closing shift at the restaurant I work at. I don't drive, so most days I'll ride my bike the half-hour trip to work, because when I close, the ride home at midnight is nice and relaxing after a stressful day of work. Well, that day was different. I finished up my work and got changed into my biking clothes. At the time, I was listening to the book It by Stephen King as I was on a horror binge. Well, that night was a night that listening to horror would freak me out more than usual. The first half of my bike ride was uneventful as usual, just the nice, relaxing sounds of my book and the night. Now, there's a bridge I have to go over that goes over the Colorado River. I cross it to get home. This bridge is steep, so usually I step off my bike and walk up the bridge, which also lets me take in the night air and the beauty of the moon over the river. Well, that night, as I'm about halfway up the bridge, I start to hear the sound of a child crying. At first, I think it's just my book, so I continue walking. Then I hear the sound again. This time I get uneasy, feeling like something is wrong. So I take my earbuds out to see if it's just my book. When I hear the sound again, I decide to cross over the other side of the bridge to shore where the crying seems to be coming from, to see if I could find anything out of the ordinary. The shore on the river consists mostly of rock and some tall grass. I could still hear the sound, but I didn't see anything on the bank. So I kept walking, getting higher on the bridge to see if I can see anything down there. I wanted to go down myself and take a look, but I also didn't want to risk getting myself hurt, so I continued the last 10 minutes or so home with that sound in the back of my mind. I got home pretty creeped out about what happened, so I got on my computer and played some games for a couple of hours and went to bed. I didn't even think to call the police to report it. The next morning, I told my mom what happened, and she thought it was weird, but at least she believed me that I really did hear something that night. My dad and brother thought I was crazy, but I still remember what happened to this day. Ghost in the Warehouse, from TDN. I used to work in an auto parts warehouse for about 2 years. In that time, I experienced a few unexplainable and possibly paranormal occurrences, either completely alone or with a friend or two. I started back in December of 2020. I had just lost my grandmother to COVID-19, which will have some relevance in a second. I came back to work probably earlier than I should have, after being off for only a week to grieve. I was using work to just block everything out that was going on. So when I saw what I saw, I chalked it up to grief and shock taking over my brain. I was working on some car parts one day, just labeling and scanning parts and putting them in bins. I turned towards one of the bay doors behind me, specifically number 20, which is where I always saw it. And for a split second, I saw a human-shaped figure. But it was too quick to catch, because as soon as I focused on it, it was gone. As I stated before, I saw it more than just that once. But for every time I saw it, it just made me continue to think that I was just in shock over my grandmother's passing. That was until my friend/coworker was working with me one day at the same computer. We were just scanning parts as per usual, listening to music and zoning out. Then he just stops in his tracks and looks towards Bay 20. He turns to me and says, did you see that? I instantly knew what he was talking about. Or at least I'd hoped I knew. You mean the shadow guy next to Bay 20? Yeah, he's always hiding over there. I said it as a joke, because honestly I didn't expect him to agree with me. But he did, and the face he gave me was that of utter confusion and disbelief. We saw the shadow guy a bunch more times after that, but it was nothing more than just us seeing a glimpse of him, and then nothing. 2 other coworkers also came up to me asking if I saw the shadow guy by Bay 20, so it was nice to know it wasn't just me. The second occurrence was something I really didn't ever expect to experience. This one I still can't get over or explain. Our job required us to work one mandatory Saturday every month. Overtime was included, and it was only 4 hours just to make up some extra work. Plus, they usually bought pizza at the end of the shift, so it was actually pretty nice. People left you alone. You zone out, listen to a podcast, and just label car parts. But the one thing that sucked was that it was just receiving and picking that were doing anything. There were 2 pickers and the receiving team, which included me, so the rest of the warehouse was completely empty. You also needed a key to get in if you went outside at all during the shift. So needless to say, it's pretty creepy. That Saturday in particular, it was me and 2 other receivers for the shift, and both pickers decided not to show up, so it was just the 3 of us in the entire warehouse for 4 hours. Most of the shift went fine. We actually got a lot done in that short time. Needless to say, it went pretty smooth, except when I had to use the bathroom. The only bathroom was on the literal opposite side of the warehouse, about a 3-minute walk. I decided to take the forklift. Again, the warehouse is empty besides the 3 of us, so it was pretty darn creepy just driving a forklift through a dark, empty warehouse. I get to the bathroom, do my business, and leave. To preface what I saw happen, the lights in the warehouse are all motion activated, so just before you go under one it turns on, and that goes for every single light except the one above the main entrance. Anyway, I get back on the forklift, and I feel all creeped out, so I just instantly try and get out of there. As I'm driving down the main path between shipping and all the aisles of car parts, I look towards the aisles, and I start to notice the lights all the way at the end of each one start turning on. Not the ones next to me, but the ones literally on the other end. One by one they turn on, keeping pace with the forklift. But it's not matching the speed, it's just a little bit slower. Eventually I get back to receiving without getting attacked by a demon or anything, and I think it's over. When I walk past the computers my coworkers are working at, I explained what I saw, obviously thinking I sounded like a lunatic. But they gave me shocked and confused expressions at the exact same time. Apparently, as they heard me coming down the long path with the forklift, the radio my supervisor was carrying started to crackle, as if someone was hitting the talk button on the other end with another radio, which stopped just as I turned the corner into receiving, which, if you remember what I said before, there wasn't anyone else besides us in the warehouse, and the channel for the radio was specific to just the handhelds we had in the warehouse. There are plenty of other things that happened in that creepy place, but these were the most significant, and definitely the ones that I can't explain and probably will never be able to. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.